Everybody thinks they know the face of genius: white marble, Italian master, Renaissance legend. The story goes like this. A brilliant sculptor rises out of Florence, paints a chapel ceiling, sculpts gods out of stone, and becomes the symbol of European artistic perfection. Simple, clean, comfortable. But here's the problem. When you start pulling at the threads of the story surrounding Michelangelo, things stop lining up. Portraits don't match descriptions. Early records contradict later paintings. And the Renaissance itself, this so-called rebirth of European genius, starts looking a lot less European the deeper you go. Now pause for a second and ask yourself something. Why do we assume we know what these historical figures look like? Because of paintings. Paintings made decades, sometimes centuries, after they were alive. So here's the real question. What if the image of Michelangelo that lives in museums today isn't the original image at all? What if it's a repaint? Because when historians go back to the earliest descriptions of the man himself, they find something interesting. Not blonde hair, not pale skin, not the delicate European features that appear in later portraits. Instead, several contemporaries described Michelangelo as having a darker complexion, thick curly hair, and strong facial structure that didn't resemble the aristocratic Italian norm of the 1500s. That alone doesn't prove anything, but it opens a door. And once that door opens, the Renaissance starts revealing something historians rarely talk about. Because the Europe of the 1400s and 1500s was not the isolated white continent people imagine today. It was connected to Africa through trade, scholarship, migration, and war. North African Moors ruled parts of Europe for centuries. African diplomats walked through royal courts. Scholars from the Islamic world preserved ancient Greek knowledge, while Europe struggled through its darkest centuries. In other words, the Renaissance didn't rise in a vacuum. It rose on knowledge flowing out of Africa and the Islamic world. And Michelangelo was born right in the middle of that cultural collision. Florence in the late 1400s was one of the most international cities in Europe. Merchants from across the Mediterranean moved through its markets. African servants, soldiers, and artisans lived inside the city walls. Paintings from the time show black figures not as curiosities, but as part of everyday life. Now here's where things get even more interesting. One of the most famous sculptures ever created by Michelangelo is David, a perfect human form carved from marble. Heroic, powerful, idealized. But art historians have long pointed out something strange about the sculpture. The facial structure of David doesn't resemble the classical Greek models Renaissance artists usually copied. The nose is wider, the lips fuller, the bone structure heavier. Subtle details, but enough that some modern scholars have quietly questioned whether the ideal man Michelangelo carved was influenced by features outside the traditional European canon. Now, that alone still doesn't mean the artist himself was black, but it raises a deeper question about influence. Because Renaissance artists didn't just study Roman statues, they studied everything they could find: ancient Egyptian sculptures, Nubian carvings, North African architecture, Islamic mathematics, African pigments used in early painting techniques. The Mediterranean world was a crossroads, not a wall. And yet, when modern textbooks tell the story of the Renaissance, that African connection almost disappears. It becomes a purely European miracle, as if Florence woke up one day and reinvented civilization by itself. But history rarely works like that. Knowledge moves, people move, Ideas travel across oceans, which brings us back to Michelangelo himself, the man, not the myth, because the most widely recognized portraits of Michelangelo weren't painted when he was young. Many were created later in his life or even after his death by artists who never actually met him. And that matters because the Renaissance had a habit that would become very important in later centuries. Artists reshaped history through paint. Kings were made taller, saints were made whiter, enemies were made uglier, and sometimes people were quietly transformed into something they were not. So the question isn't just whether Michelangelo could have had African ancestry. The question is why that possibility almost never gets discussed. Why every modern depiction of Renaissance genius follows the same visual formula, same skin tone, same features, same narrative. Because if even one major figure of the Renaissance didn't fit that mold, then the entire story of European artistic purity starts to crack. And once that crack appears, historians have to confront a much bigger reality. The Renaissance may not have been a purely European rebirth at all. It may have been the product of centuries of African, Moorish, and Mediterranean knowledge flowing into Europe, reshaping art, science, and philosophy from the inside out. Which leads to a far more uncomfortable question. If Renaissance Europe borrowed so much from Africa and the Islamic world, then how many of its greatest icons have been quietly repainted to fit a later narrative? And when we start digging into the life of Michelangelo himself, the apprenticeships he took, the circles he moved in, the people who influenced his work, we begin to uncover something historians rarely talk about. Because hidden inside the workshops, libraries, and secret studies of Renaissance Florence, there was a network of knowledge that traced directly back to Africa. And once you see that network, the story of Michelangelo stops looking like a simple tale of Italian genius. It starts looking like something much bigger, something the history books might not be ready to admit. So the real question isn't just what Michelangelo created. The real question is this: who taught him to see the world the way he did? And that question takes us straight into the workshop. Not the polished museum version, the real one. Stone dust in the air, hammer blows echoing off the walls, young apprentices hauling marble blocks while masters argue about anatomy, philosophy, and geometry. This is where Michelangelo was actually shaped. And the first thing you notice when you study Renaissance workshops is this: artists didn't just learn to paint. They studied the human body like scientists. Bones, muscles, proportion, motion. Some even dissected corpses in secret, mapping the mechanics of the body the way engineers study machines. Michelangelo was obsessive about it. He spent nights studying anatomy so intensely that later writers described him as almost frightening in his dedication. Every tendon, every muscle group, every shift of weight in the body, he wanted to understand it perfectly before carving it in stone. But here's the strange part. The anatomical knowledge circulating in Renaissance Italy didn't appear out of nowhere. Much of it had been preserved and expanded centuries earlier in medical schools across the Islamic world. Physicians from North Africa and the Middle East translated Greek texts, corrected errors, and added new observations about the human body. Those works moved slowly west through trade routes, libraries, and scholars traveling between cultures. By the time Florence exploded into artistic innovation, that knowledge was already flowing through its intellectual circles, which meant young artists like Michelangelo weren't just inheriting Roman sculpture, They were inheriting a global archive of science. Now imagine being a teenager stepping into that environment. A city packed with manuscripts, foreign ideas, mathematical discoveries, and ancient philosophies suddenly available to curious minds. It wasn't just art school, it was an information storm. And Michelangelo found himself in the center of it because of one powerful man, Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, a banker so wealthy and influential that his palace functioned like a private university. Philosophers, poets, mathematicians, and artists gathered under his patronage. Young Michelangelo was invited into that circle while still a teenager. That changed everything, because inside the Medici Gardens sat one of the most unusual collections in Europe, ancient sculptures from across the Mediterranean world, Greek statues, Roman busts, fragments believed to come from Egypt, reliefs whose origins stretched far beyond Italy. Students were encouraged to copy them, analyze them, and debate their meaning. Think about what that does to a young artist's mind. You're not just studying local traditions. You're absorbing visual languages from multiple civilizations at once. And Michelangelo didn't treat those pieces as museum relics. He treated them like puzzles. How did these artists capture movement in stone? Why did certain cultures emphasize different facial structures? Why were some figures stylized while others aimed for natural realism? Those questions pushed him toward something radical. Instead of copying a single tradition, he began synthesizing them, combining classical balance with dramatic motion, blending idealized forms with raw physical tension. The result was a style that looked completely new to his contemporaries, powerful, almost explosive, which brings us to one of the most intense projects of his career, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Now, the popular story is that Michelangelo reluctantly painted it. He considered himself a sculptor, not a painter. Yet once he began, something remarkable happened. Over 4 years, he covered the vast ceiling with hundreds of figures, prophets, ancestors, mythic scenes of creation. But look closely at those figures. They are not delicate Renaissance nobles. They are massive, dense, muscles twisting like coiled rope under skin, bodies carrying a weight that feels ancient. Some art historians have pointed out that the physical power of these figures resembles sculptural traditions from regions far older than Renaissance Italy, traditions where the human body represented strength, endurance, and spiritual force. Michelangelo wasn't just decorating a chapel, he was building a visual language that fused philosophy, anatomy, religion, and ancient symbolism. And that fusion made people uneasy, because it broke the neat categories scholars like to use: Greek, Roman, Christian. Michelangelo blurred those lines until they were almost impossible to separate. His prophets looked like warriors. His saints looked like athletes. His divine figures carry the raw physicality of humanity itself. It was revolutionary, and revolutions create enemies. Critics began attacking his work almost immediately. Some called the bodies too muscular, too physical, too wild for sacred art. Others complained that his figures looked foreign compared to the softer religious images people were used to. That word matters, foreign, because Florence during this time was also wrestling with identity. The city wanted to present itself as the pure rebirth of classical Europe, but the truth was messier. Its wealth flowed through Mediterranean trade routes. Its libraries contained translated manuscripts from Arabic scholars. Its streets held merchants, travelers, and laborers from across continents. The Renaissance was global long before people used that word, and Michelangelo's art reflected that collision of worlds, which leads to another fascinating detail about the man himself. He rarely cared about fitting in. He dressed simply, worked obsessively, ignored social expectations. While other artists chased fame and courtly approval, Michelangelo locked himself in studios for months, carving stone until his hands bled. There's a reason later writers described him as almost feral in his devotion to creation. He wasn't trying to become a symbol of European culture. He was chasing something deeper, a universal form of human power carved into marble and pigment. And that obsession produced work so overwhelming that people started mythologizing him even while he was alive. Stories spread about his temper, his isolation, his strange intensity. But myths do something dangerous. They simplify. They flatten a complicated life into a single narrative that fits cultural expectations. The more Michelangelo's legend grew, the more his image became standardized, cleaned up, reframed. By the time later generations painted portraits of him, the wild young artist of Florence had been transformed into something safer, a neatly packaged icon of Renaissance Europe. And that transformation raises another uncomfortable possibility, because when a society turns a real person into a symbol, it often reshapes the face that represents the symbol. So the deeper historians dig into the life of Michelangelo, the apprenticeships, the patrons, the intellectual currents surrounding him, the more complicated the picture becomes. Not just about his art, about his identity. Because scattered across letters, sketches, and eyewitness descriptions are clues suggesting the man behind the legend may not match the image history preserved, which leads to a discovery that has quietly unsettled some art historians: a forgotten portrait, painted much closer to Michelangelo's lifetime. That shows a face very different from the one most people recognize today. And once you see it, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Who changed the image of Michelangelo, and why? Because that forgotten portrait doesn't live in the spotlight. It's not the version printed in textbooks. It's not the image reproduced on museum posters or art history slides. Instead, it sits quietly in the background of Renaissance scholarship, mentioned in footnotes, debated in academic circles, and often passed over when popular history packages the story for mass audiences. The portrait was created by Daniele da Volterra, a painter who personally knew Michelangelo and worked closely with him during the later years of the master's life. That matters, because Volterra wasn't imagining the artist from memory decades later. He saw him, spoke with him, observed him at work, and when you look at Volterra's depiction, something stands out immediately. The skin tone appears darker than the pale versions that dominate later reproductions. The hair is dense and tightly curled. The face is weathered, broad, and heavy in structure. It doesn't resemble the refined Renaissance stereotype we've come to expect. Now pause here. None of this proves a dramatic claim by itself. Portraits vary. Lighting, pigments, aging paint, and artistic interpretation all influence what we see centuries later. But the difference between early depictions and later ones raises a serious question about historical imagery. Because portraits are never neutral. They reflect the cultural assumptions of the time they were created. And Renaissance Italy was entering a period where identity politics, religious, cultural, and geographic, were becoming increasingly intense. The Mediterranean world was shifting. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had reshaped trade routes and intellectual migration. Ottoman power expanded into southeastern Europe. North African dynasties controlled strategic ports across the southern Mediterranean, and European courts were becoming more conscious of defining themselves against the cultures surrounding them. Art became one of the tools used to shape that narrative. Images communicated who belonged at the center of civilization and who existed at the edges. That process didn't happen overnight. It evolved gradually. In the early Renaissance, artists were still deeply fascinated with foreign cultures. You can see it in paintings filled with exotic fabrics, African attendants, and scholars studying texts that came through Arabic translations. But as Europe moved toward the age of exploration and imperial expansion, the tone began to change. Cultural lines hardened, visual identity became political, and historical figures started being repainted, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, to fit emerging ideas about what European greatness should look like. This brings us back to the image of Michelangelo, because when later artists portrayed him, they weren't just recording a face, they were constructing a symbol, the symbol of the Renaissance master, the embodiment of European artistic genius. And symbols are polished, simplified, standardized, which means the image we recognize today may not represent a neutral snapshot of the man who lived in Florence. It may represent the version later generations needed him to be. Think about how often this happens throughout history. Ancient statues lose their original colors and become white marble icons. Historical leaders are portrayed with idealized features that match the cultural ideals of the era depicting them. Over time, repetition turns these images into unquestioned truth. But occasionally, an earlier layer of history resurfaces, a sketch, a letter, a forgotten portrait, something that disrupts the tidy version of the past. That disruption is exactly what Voltaire's depiction does, not because it proves a single theory, but because it reminds us that the visual record of history is constantly filtered through cultural lenses. And Michelangelo's life was already filled with contradictions that challenge simple narratives. Take his relationship with religion, for example. He worked for popes, decorated the most famous chapel in Christianity, yet his writings reveal a restless spiritual mind that wrestled constantly with questions about the nature of the human soul. He wrote poems about divine beauty, mortality, and the struggle between earthly existence and spiritual perfection. In those writings, he often described the human body as a vessel of divine power, a physical form capable of expressing something sacred. That idea had roots far beyond Renaissance Italy. Across the Mediterranean world, artistic traditions had long explored the connection between physical strength and spiritual meaning. Ancient Egyptian statues portrayed rulers as embodiments of divine authority through their bodies. Nubian kings carved images emphasizing muscular form as a sign of cosmic balance and leadership. In various African sculptural traditions, the human figure represented both physical reality and metaphysical energy. Whether Michelangelo consciously studied those traditions or absorbed their influence indirectly through the cultural exchange of the Mediterranean is still debated. But his art clearly shared that philosophy. The human body in his work is never passive. It carries tension, purpose, a sense of inner force waiting to burst through stone. That philosophy reached its peak in one of his most haunting sculptures, the unfinished figures known as the prisoners. These statues appear to struggle as if they are trying to break free from the marble itself. Muscles twist, arms strain, faces emerge halfway from the rock. It's as if Michelangelo believed the figure already existed inside the stone and his job was simply to release it. That concept fascinated later thinkers. Some saw it as a metaphor for the human soul trapped in physical form. Others saw it as the artist's attempt to reveal the hidden potential inside every human being. But there's another layer to consider. If Michelangelo believed forms already existed inside the stone, then the role of the artist wasn't to invent beauty, it was to uncover it. And that belief aligns with a philosophical idea shared across multiple cultures of the ancient world. Truth is not created, it is revealed, which makes the mystery surrounding Michelangelo's own image even more intriguing. Because if the artist dedicated his life to revealing the hidden form inside marble, then history may still be trying to reveal the hidden form inside his own story. And once researchers began comparing portraits, letters, and eyewitness descriptions more carefully, they noticed something even stranger than the variations in appearance. Several early accounts describe Michelangelo using a nickname for himself that hardly anyone talks about today, a nickname connected to the color of stone he loved working with most, a stone that artists across the Mediterranean associated with something far older than the Renaissance, something that traced back through Egypt, Nubia, and the ancient civilizations of Africa. And when historians started tracing that connection, they stumbled onto a cultural thread that runs straight through Michelangelo's world, linking Florence not just to Rome and Greece, but to African artistic traditions that had been influencing Mediterranean culture for thousands of years, which raises a new question. If those influences were already shaping Renaissance art, then how much of Michelangelo's genius was actually part of a much older story the history books barely mention? That older story begins long before Florence, long before Renaissance workshops, long before the marble quarries that supplied Michelangelo's sculptures. To understand the artistic language he was speaking, you have to travel much further back along the Mediterranean world, back to the civilizations that first mastered the art of turning stone into human presence. Because carving the human body from rock wasn't a Renaissance invention, it was an inheritance. And some of the earliest masters of that inheritance were working along the Nile thousands of years before Italy ever became the center of European art. In ancient Egypt, sculptors developed an obsession with permanence. Their statues were not just decorative objects, they were vessels for the spirit, physical anchors meant to preserve identity long after death. That belief changed how artists approached the human form. Bodies were carved with intention. Posture signified authority. Muscles represented vitality. Every detail carried symbolic meaning, and those sculptural traditions didn't remain isolated along the Nile. They traveled. Merchants carried art across ports. Soldiers encountered foreign monuments. Scholars copied proportions and techniques into manuscripts that later moved through the Mediterranean. By the time classical Greek sculptors began creating their famous statues, they had already encountered Egyptian models that demonstrated how stone could hold the shape of the human body. Greek historians even recorded visiting Egyptian temples and studying their art. Centuries later, Roman collectors filled villas with copies of those Greek statues. Then Rome collapsed. Europe fractured. But the sculptures didn't disappear. Many were buried, preserved in soil or ruins for centuries. And when Renaissance Italy began excavating ancient sites, Those statues resurfaced like ghosts from earlier civilizations. Artists suddenly had access to a massive archive of ancient forms. Michelangelo spent years studying them, not casually, obsessively. He measured proportions, examined how weight shifted through the hips and shoulders, and tried to understand why those ancient figures looked so alive despite being carved from lifeless stone. But something important often gets left out of that story. Many of the sculptures Renaissance artists studied were Roman copies of earlier Greek works, and some Greek works had themselves been influenced by contact with Egypt and North Africa. In other words, the artistic DNA flowing through Renaissance sculpture was already layered with cross-Mediterranean exchange. It wasn't a straight line from Athens to Florence. It was a long chain of borrowing, adaptation, and reinterpretation stretching across continents. Michelangelo stepped into that chain at a moment when artists were rediscovering these fragments and trying to decode their secrets, and he pushed the tradition further than anyone before him. Instead of simply recreating classical poses, he amplified them. Figures twist dramatically. Muscles swell with exaggerated tension. Bodies feel as though they are carrying emotional weight, not just physical mass. Look at the sculpture known as the Pietà. A grieving mother holds the body of her son across her lap. But the scene isn't fragile. The figures possess monumental gravity, as if carved from the same ancient language that shaped temple statues along the Nile centuries earlier. Art historians often describe this quality using a simple phrase, terribilita. It translates loosely to awe-inspiring power. Michelangelo's figures don't just exist, they confront you. Stand in front of one of his sculptures and the body feels larger than life, not in size, but in presence. That quality separates his work from many of his contemporaries. Other artists pursued elegance. Michelangelo pursued force, and force requires understanding the body not as decoration, but as structure, which is why he spent years traveling to the marble quarries of Carrara. High in the mountains of northern Italy, these quarries produced the bright stone Renaissance sculptors loved. Michelangelo didn't simply order marble blocks and wait for them to arrive. He climbed the quarries himself, surveyed the rock faces, chose specific slabs based on how he imagined a figure hidden inside them. Workers described him scrambling across cliffs, searching for the right stone as if he were hunting. That process shaped the way he thought about sculpture. A flawed block could destroy months of work. A perfect block allowed the figure to emerge cleanly from the stone. This relationship between artist and material became almost spiritual for him. Letters from the time show him speaking about marble as if it had personality, resisting the sculptor until the correct approach revealed its inner form. That idea connects directly to the nickname historians later noticed in early references to Michelangelo. Some apprentices reportedly joked that he treated marble like a living thing. He spoke to it, studied its veins, even described certain pieces as possessing darker blood running through the stone. Those descriptions might sound poetic, but they hint at something deeper about the artistic philosophy he inherited. Across many ancient cultures, stone was never considered truly lifeless. It held energy, memory, the weight of geological time. Carving it wasn't just craftsmanship, it was transformation. And Michelangelo behaved like someone participating in that transformation every time he picked up a chisel. Which brings us to a detail most casual art fans never hear: The marble used for several of his most famous works contains subtle mineral variations that create slightly darker tones within the surface. Under certain lighting conditions, those veins give the sculpture depth and warmth that pure white stone lacks. To Michelangelo, those imperfections were not flaws, they were clues to where the hidden figure wanted to emerge. The artist followed those natural lines through the stone the way a navigator follows currents in the ocean, and that philosophy may explain something historians still debate. Michelangelo rarely polished his sculptures to the smooth perfection many Renaissance artists preferred. Some areas remained rough, textured, almost unfinished, but those rough surfaces allowed light to interact with the stone in ways that made the body appear more alive. The effect can be subtle. Stand back and the figure seems complete. Move closer and the surface still carries the marks of struggle between artist and material. That tension became a signature of his style, and it reveals something about how he saw the world. Creation was not clean, it was conflict. Stone resisted the sculptor, the body resisted the soul. Human beings struggled toward something greater, but never fully escaped the limits of their physical form. That belief echoes through nearly everything Michelangelo produced, which makes the mystery surrounding his own physical identity even more fascinating. Because the more historians examine his work, influences, and philosophy, the harder it becomes to fit him neatly inside the narrow image Renaissance Europe later constructed. His art was shaped by traditions stretching far beyond Italy. His intellectual environment was saturated with ideas traveling across continents, and the surviving depictions of his face refused to settle into a single, consistent version. It's as if the man who spent his life revealing hidden forms inside stone left behind a puzzle inside history itself. A puzzle about how artistic genius is shaped, remembered, and sometimes rewritten. And solving that puzzle requires looking beyond Florence entirely, because just as Michelangelo searched distant quarries for the right marble, the origins of the artistic language he mastered may lie far outside the borders of Renaissance Europe. Far outside those borders sits a region the Renaissance loved to admire, but rarely admitted it learned from: the southern shore of the Mediterranean, North Africa. For centuries before the Renaissance ever began, scholars, merchants, engineers, and artists were moving across that sea like it was a highway. Ideas didn't stay put. Geometry, astronomy, medicine, architecture, these things moved with people, and wherever knowledge traveled, art followed close behind. Florence, Venice, Genoa. These Italian cities didn't grow rich in isolation. Their ships were constantly sailing south and east, trading fabrics, metalwork, pigments, and manuscripts with ports along the African and Middle Eastern coastlines. That traffic created something historians now call the Mediterranean Knowledge Network. Not an empire, not one culture dominating another, but a web of exchange. Mathematical texts translated in Cairo could end up studied in Sicily. Architectural techniques from Tunisia could influence building methods in southern Spain. Decorative motifs carved in North Africa could appear decades later inside Italian cathedrals, and artists absorbed all of it. Renaissance workshops weren't sealed bubbles of European tradition. They were laboratories built on centuries of shared knowledge flowing across continents. Michelangelo grew up in the middle of that exchange because Florence itself had deep commercial ties across the Mediterranean world. Merchants brought back luxury goods, strange minerals, new pigments, and Most important for artists, ideas about form and proportion. Some of those ideas had roots in African artistic traditions that Europeans encountered through trade and diplomacy. One example appears in the Renaissance fascination with powerful physical bodies in sculpture. Many cultures around the Mediterranean represented rulers with idealized forms, but certain African traditions emphasized something slightly different. Authority expressed through muscular density, a body that looked capable of carrying immense spiritual or political power. That same physical intensity shows up repeatedly in Michelangelo's work. Not delicate beauty, weight, force, potential energy. Look at the figure of David. The statue is often described as the perfect Renaissance hero, calm, confident, poised before battle. But stand in front of the sculpture and something else becomes obvious. The body is enormous compared to earlier classical figures. The hands are oversized. Veins run across the arms like cables under the skin. It feels less like a calm prince and more like a coiled force waiting to explode. Michelangelo carved that statue from a block of marble that other sculptors had already rejected. The stone had flaws, narrow dimensions. Most artists assumed nothing great could come from it. Michelangelo saw something different. He studied the block for weeks before touching it, tracing shapes with charcoal, imagining how the internal cracks might guide the form. Then he began carving. 3 years later, the rejected marble became one of the most famous sculptures in human history. But here's what makes the story fascinating. The final statue didn't match the polite classical proportions scholars expected. The head and hands are intentionally larger than the rest of the body. Why? Because Michelangelo understood something about perspective. The sculpture was meant to stand high above viewers in the city square. From below, those exaggerated proportions create the illusion of perfect balance. It's a trick of visual mathematics, but it's also something artists across many ancient cultures already knew. Egyptian temple statues often used similar adjustments so figures would appear correct when viewed from ground level. Bodies weren't carved for theoretical perfection. They were carved for how humans actually see. Michelangelo applied that same logic instinctively, which again raises the question of where he absorbed such ideas. Renaissance Italy celebrated Greek and Roman examples, but the deeper artistic traditions of the Mediterranean often reached further south. Trade routes linking Italy to North Africa had existed for centuries before Michelangelo was born. Craftsmen traveled those routes. So did scholars and engineers. Every port city became a meeting place for techniques and philosophies that blended quietly over time. Artists rarely documented those exchanges formally. They simply absorbed what worked. A carving method here, a proportional system there, a way of representing movement learned from a sculpture glimpsed in a foreign harbor. And when those influences combined in the hands of someone like Michelangelo, the result looked revolutionary. Not because it appeared from nowhere, but because centuries of shared knowledge suddenly crystallized inside a single artist's vision. That might explain why his work often feels older than the Renaissance itself. The bodies he carved look ancient, timeless, almost mythological, like echoes of civilizations that existed long before Florence became famous for art. Even Michelangelo's unfinished sculptures seem to carry that sense of deep time. The figures appear trapped halfway between raw rock and living flesh, as if they belong to two worlds simultaneously, the natural world of stone and the human world of movement. Some scholars think this effect came from Michelangelo's belief that sculptures already existed inside the marble before he touched them. He simply removed what didn't belong. But there's another way to read that philosophy. Maybe he wasn't just revealing hidden figures. Maybe he was reconnecting with an artistic language that had been buried beneath centuries of cultural change. Because the Renaissance often describes itself as a rebirth, a rediscovery of classical knowledge after Europe's medieval period. Yet rebirth implies something very specific. The knowledge already existed. It just had to be found again. And many of the ideas Renaissance artists celebrated had survived outside Europe during the centuries when Western institutions lost access to them. They lived in translated manuscripts, architectural traditions, scientific treatises, artistic practices preserved across the Mediterranean world. By the time Florence embraced the Renaissance, those ideas were quietly flowing back through trade routes, libraries, and cultural exchange. Artists like Michelangelo inherited the results, which makes the question about his identity far more complicated than a simple label. Was he Italian? Of course, a Florentine citizen shaped by his time and place. But his art was the product of something much larger, a network of knowledge stretching across continents and centuries. And once you see that network, a different picture of Renaissance creativity begins to emerge, one where genius doesn't appear in isolation. It grows where cultures collide, where ideas travel, where artists absorb influences from worlds far beyond their own borders. Michelangelo stood at exactly that crossroads, and his sculptures became the physical proof of what happens when those influences finally meet inside a single mind. But there's still one piece of the story left to confront, because the Renaissance didn't last forever. Eventually, Europe entered an age where cultural lines hardened and historical narratives became more controlled. And during that shift, the story of where Renaissance knowledge truly came from began to change, subtly at first, then dramatically. Figures were recast, influences were simplified, entire chapters of cultural exchange faded from the popular version of history, which means the final mystery surrounding Michelangelo isn't just about his face, it's about the world that shaped him. A world far more interconnected than the version most textbooks still teach today. And once you start pulling on that thread, you realize the Renaissance itself may have been telling only half the story, and that missing half of the story begins to appear the moment you follow the paper trail. Because art doesn't exist without records, contracts, letters, payments. Arguments between patrons and artists about deadlines and money. Michelangelo left behind thousands of documents, notes scribbled to family members, complaints to assistants, instructions to stone workers, receipts for materials. When historians read those papers carefully, something unexpected appears. Michelangelo was constantly surrounded by people who came from outside the neat cultural borders modern history likes to draw. Stonecutters from different regions, laborers who spoke different dialects, merchants delivering pigments and minerals that had traveled across oceans and deserts before arriving in Florence. The Renaissance workshop was never a sealed Italian environment. It was more like a crossroads, a place where hands from many places contributed to a single work of art. And Michelangelo depended heavily on that network. Take the pigments used in Renaissance painting. The brilliant blues came from lapis lazuli, mined in Afghanistan. Certain reds were derived from insects harvested in distant lands. Gold leaf came through trade routes stretching deep into Africa and Asia. Even the paper used for sketches often relied on materials imported through Mediterranean commerce. So every time Michelangelo painted or drew, the world was already present in the tools he held. But there's another detail hiding inside those documents that rarely makes it into popular history. Michelangelo frequently dealt with merchants from Mediterranean port cities that served as gateways between Europe and Africa, places where cultures mixed constantly. Those cities were not culturally uniform. They were multilingual, multi-ethnic, and filled with travelers carrying ideas in every direction. When artists visited them, they encountered artistic objects and visual traditions unlike anything found in inland European towns: carved ivories, metalwork with intricate geometric patterns, textiles whose designs reflected centuries of symbolic meaning. These objects circulated widely through trade networks. Collectors in Italian cities prized them. Some pieces ended up inside aristocratic cabinets of curiosity, private collections where wealthy patrons stored rare artifacts from across the world. Artists were often invited to study those collections. They sketched the objects, borrowed motifs, and absorbed new ways of thinking about form and decoration. Michelangelo moved in circles where those collections existed, and while there is no surviving diary entry where he writes, "Today, I studied African sculpture," the visual vocabulary in Renaissance workshops tells a broader story. Motifs migrated. Patterns reappeared in unexpected places. Human figures took on physical characteristics that echoed older artistic traditions far beyond Italy. None of this required direct imitation. Influence often works more quietly. An artist sees a carving once. Months later, while shaping marble, a similar rhythm of form appears almost unconsciously. Ideas travel through memory, and Michelangelo's memory was legendary. Contemporaries described him as someone who could glance at a sculpture once and later reproduce its proportions without measuring tools. That ability meant his artistic vocabulary expanded constantly. Every statue he studied became another reference point stored in his mind. So when people ask where Michelangelo's style came from, the real answer may be everywhere he looked. Florence provided the environment, but the ingredients flowed in from across the Mediterranean world, which leads to a moment late in Michelangelo's life that reveals something important about how he saw himself. When he was already famous, wealthy patrons tried repeatedly to convince him to produce more portraits and self-images. They wanted a visual record of the great master. Michelangelo refused most of those requests. He disliked portraiture, thought it distracted from the deeper purpose of art. On the rare occasions he did include his own likeness inside a work, it appeared in strange places, distorted, hidden, almost like a private joke. One of the most famous examples appears in his fresco, The Last Judgment, inside the Sistine Chapel. Among the many figures swirling across the wall, there is a flayed human skin held by Saint Bartholomew. Look closely at that sagging skin. The face resembles Michelangelo himself. It's an unsettling image. Instead of portraying himself as a heroic artist, he appears as an empty shell. Some historians interpret this as a sign of humility. Others see it as a reflection of spiritual anxiety, but it also shows something else. Michelangelo did not seem particularly interested in controlling how the world remembered his physical appearance. He cared about the work, the sculptures, the architecture, the visual language carved into stone. Everything else was secondary. That attitude may explain why the visual record of his face is so inconsistent. If the artist himself didn't obsess over preserving a single official portrait, later generations had plenty of room to reinterpret his image. Painters working decades after his death produced portraits based on earlier sketches or descriptions. Each version reflected the cultural expectations of the time it was created. Gradually, one particular look became dominant: a pale, stern Renaissance genius staring out from textbooks and museum walls. Once that version repeated often enough, it hardened into historical fact. But the earlier layers never disappeared entirely. They still sit inside archives, museum storage rooms, and obscure art history publications waiting to be rediscovered. And every time someone revisits those sources, the same realization tends to emerge. The Renaissance was never a closed European miracle. It was a moment when knowledge from many civilizations collided and produced something extraordinary. Michelangelo stood at the center of that collision. His art carried echoes of ancient Egypt, classical Greece, Roman engineering, Islamic mathematics, and the visual traditions circulating through Mediterranean trade. All of it fused inside the mind of a single relentless sculptor. Which means the real question isn't simply whether Michelangelo himself looked different from the portrait history settled on. The deeper question is why the Renaissance has often been presented as if it belonged to one culture alone. Because the evidence scattered through documents, trade routes, artistic techniques, and surviving artifacts tells a different story. A story of exchange, of borrowing, of civilizations learning from each other over thousands of years. And if that larger story were taught more openly, the Renaissance might stop looking like a sudden explosion of genius in one corner of Europe. Instead, it would look like the latest chapter in a much older human tradition. The tradition of knowledge, traveling across borders, and reshaping the world wherever it arrives. Which brings us back to the central mystery. If Michelangelo's art was the product of such a vast network of influences, then how many other figures from history have been simplified into symbols that hide the true complexity of their origins? And more importantly, what happens when we finally start uncovering the full story behind them? That question sends us somewhere uncomfortable for traditional history, because the moment you begin digging into how historical figures become symbols, you start noticing a pattern. Great individuals are rarely remembered exactly as they were. They are edited, refined, repackaged so they fit the identity a society wants to promote. Sometimes that editing is harmless. Details get simplified so the public can understand the story easily, but other times the changes run deeper. Entire environments disappear from the narrative. Connections between cultures fade from view, and a figure who once existed inside a global web of influence becomes the representative of a single civilization. The Renaissance is full of examples like this. Painters, architects, engineers, many of them learned from ideas that traveled through Spain, North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Yet later histories often retold their achievements as if the inspiration appeared purely within European borders. Michelangelo's legend grew during exactly that period of historical reshaping. By the late 16th and 17th centuries, European powers were entering a new era: oceanic exploration, colonial expansion, competition between empires to define themselves as the cultural center of the world. In that environment, art history slowly began transforming. Earlier generations had spoken openly about knowledge traveling across cultures. Later writers started emphasizing something else: European uniqueness. The Renaissance became framed as a sudden rebirth of brilliance inside Europe after centuries of darkness. That narrative was powerful, simple, easy to teach. But it also required trimming away many of the complicated connections that made the Renaissance possible in the first place. And when you simplify history like that, the people inside the story often get simplified too. Michelangelo gradually became less of a restless Florentine artist working within a Mediterranean exchange network, and more of a symbolic hero of European civilization. His biography tightened, his influences narrowed, his image standardized. Generations of students learned to recognize the same portrait, the stern, pale master with intense eyes and a long beard. Once that image circulated widely, it became almost impossible to challenge, even if earlier portraits suggested a more varied appearance. Even if documents showed the artist living within a far more interconnected world. Visual repetition has enormous power. Show people the same face often enough, and it becomes truth regardless of the messy historical evidence behind it. But historians in recent decades have begun pushing back against simplified narratives, not to erase Renaissance achievements. Quite the opposite. They want to understand them more fully, which means reconstructing the networks of influence that made those achievements possible. When scholars map the movement of manuscripts, trade goods, scientific ideas, and artistic techniques during the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, the Mediterranean begins to look less like a boundary and more like a bridge. Cities along its shores were constantly sharing knowledge. Florence learned from Venice. Venice learned from Constantinople. Constantinople absorbed ideas moving through North Africa and the Middle East. Each culture added something before passing knowledge forward again. In that environment, creativity flourished, not because one civilization suddenly awakened, but because many civilizations were interacting. Michelangelo's lifetime fell right at the peak of that interaction. He had access to ancient statues being excavated from Roman ruins, mathematical theories preserved by scholars working centuries earlier. Architectural techniques passed through generations of builders moving between cultures. The raw materials of his genius came from everywhere. Yet the myth built around him later tried to reduce that complexity. Why? Because symbols are easier to celebrate than networks. A lone genius fits neatly into national pride. A global exchange of ideas forces people to acknowledge shared heritage. And shared heritage complicates the story of who owns greatness. Once historians start restoring those missing connections, the Renaissance begins to feel less like a miracle belonging to one region, and more like a moment when humanity's collective knowledge briefly aligned in the right place at the right time. Michelangelo just happened to be one of the artists capable of channeling that knowledge into unforgettable form. Think about the sculptures again, the twisting bodies, the dramatic tension in every muscle, the sense that each figure is both human and something larger than human. Those qualities didn't arise in a vacuum. They emerged from centuries of artists across many cultures experimenting with how to represent strength, divinity, and emotional intensity through the human form. Michelangelo inherited that entire visual conversation. Then he pushed it further. That's why his work still feels alive 500 years later. It contains echoes of civilizations that existed long before he picked up a chisel. And when you view his art through that wider lens, the mystery surrounding his own identity becomes less important than the world that shaped him. whether his skin was slightly darker than later portraits suggest, whether early descriptions captured features that later painters softened. Those questions are interesting, but they are only part of a larger realization. The Renaissance itself was never culturally isolated. Its greatest achievements were the result of centuries of collaboration across borders. Recognizing that doesn't diminish figures like Michelangelo, it elevates them, because it shows how extraordinary human creativity becomes when knowledge flows freely between cultures, when artists study ideas from many traditions instead of limiting themselves to one. And perhaps that is the real lesson hiding inside the puzzle of Michelangelo's image. History is not a static photograph. It's a layered record shaped by the priorities of each generation that retells it. Sometimes those generations simplify the past to serve their own identity, but the deeper you dig into original sources, the more complicated and fascinating the picture becomes. Michelangelo's life sits right in the middle of that complexity. A sculptor shaped by a city connected to the wider world, an artist whose work carries traces of ancient traditions stretching far beyond Renaissance Italy, and a historical figure whose story reminds us that culture rarely belongs to one place alone. It grows wherever ideas meet. Which leaves us with a final thought. If the Renaissance was really the product of shared knowledge moving across continents, then the story we tell about human history might need a serious update. Because once you begin restoring those forgotten connections, a different pattern emerges. One where civilizations didn't rise alone. They rose together. And the real masterpiece wasn't just the statues Michelangelo carved from marble. It was the vast network of human knowledge that made those statues possible in the first place. Once you begin looking at history through that lens, something else becomes impossible to ignore. The Renaissance didn't just rediscover ancient knowledge. It also decided which parts of that knowledge would be remembered, and which parts would quietly fade into the background, because every generation curates the past, not always with malicious intent. Sometimes it happens through simple storytelling. Teachers simplify lessons. Writers focus on dramatic heroes. Complex networks get trimmed down so a story can fit neatly into a book chapter. But when that simplification repeats for centuries, the public memory of an entire era can shift. That's exactly what happened to the Renaissance. In earlier historical writings from the 1500s and 1600s, scholars still spoke openly about how knowledge flowed across the Mediterranean world. They discussed translations of ancient texts, the role of Islamic scholars in preserving Greek philosophy, and the constant movement of merchants and ideas between continents. But as Europe entered the modern age, those details gradually received less attention. Instead, the Renaissance became framed as a uniquely European awakening, a dramatic rebirth after a supposed 1,000 years of intellectual darkness. It was a powerful narrative, and powerful narratives tend to survive. Yet historians today know the real picture was far more complex. The so-called dark centuries were filled with scientific development, architectural innovation, and philosophical debate across many regions of the world. Ideas did not vanish, they moved, and when the political and economic conditions in Italy allowed artists and scholars to rediscover those ideas, the result looked like a sudden explosion of creativity. But in reality, it was the continuation of a much older intellectual current. Michelangelo represents that moment perfectly, not because he copied foreign traditions directly, but because he lived in a world where centuries of accumulated knowledge suddenly became accessible again. Ancient manuscripts resurfaced in libraries. Lost statues emerged from buried Roman ruins. Mathematical concepts traveled west through translations and trade. Artists could study geometry, anatomy, philosophy, and engineering all at once. The environment was electric. Imagine being a young sculptor surrounded by fragments of civilizations stretching back thousands of years. You see a Roman torso dug out of the ground. You study architectural blueprints influenced by earlier engineers. You read philosophical ideas translated and debated across cultures. Everywhere you turn, the past is speaking again. Michelangelo listened carefully. He didn't simply copy what he saw. He absorbed it. Then he transformed it. That transformation is visible in the emotional intensity of his work. Earlier classical sculptures often emphasized balance and harmony. Michelangelo introduced something different: struggle. His figures twist against invisible forces. They appear to be fighting gravity, fate, even the stone itself. Look at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel again. The prophets lean forward as if delivering messages too powerful for their own bodies to contain. The ancestors crouch in cramped spaces, their muscles tense with anticipation. Even the image of creation carries dramatic momentum, with two outstretched hands reaching across a charged gap of empty space. That empty space might be one of the most famous artistic decisions ever made. Two fingers almost touching, humanity reaching toward the divine. Electric tension suspended forever in a fraction of distance. It's a moment that captures the entire Renaissance spirit. Human beings stretching toward knowledge that once seemed lost, trying to reconnect with the wisdom of earlier civilizations, trying to understand their place in a universe suddenly expanding again. Michelangelo carved that feeling into stone and paint, which is why his art still resonates. It doesn't just depict bodies, it captures the psychological energy of an age rediscovering its past. But here's the twist. If the Renaissance was really a rediscovery of shared human knowledge, then the story isn't just about Florence. It's about every culture that contributed to the chain of ideas leading there. The architects of ancient Egypt who mastered monumental stonework, the mathematicians of the classical world who explored geometry and proportion, the scholars who preserved and expanded that knowledge across centuries of translation and study. Each link in that chain mattered. Remove any one of them, and the Renaissance would look very different. Michelangelo's sculptures would still exist, but the intellectual environment that shaped them might not. That realization shifts the entire conversation. Instead of asking which civilization deserves credit for artistic genius, the more interesting question becomes, how did so many civilizations contribute to the same evolving story? Because the Renaissance didn't belong to a single nation. It was the moment when threads from many cultures finally wove together again. Michelangelo happened to be one of the artists capable of turning that tapestry of ideas into physical form, and that might explain something else about his legacy. 500 years later, people from every continent still stand in front of his work and feel the same reaction: awe. Not because the sculptures belong to one culture, but because they express something universal about the human experience: strength, struggle, creation. Those themes existed long before the Renaissance and continue long after it, which means the statues Michelangelo carved were never just symbols of one historical moment. They were part of a conversation humanity has been having for thousands of years, a conversation about who we are, where we came from, and what kind of future we might build. But there's one final piece of the puzzle we haven't addressed yet, because when modern researchers revisit Renaissance history with fresh eyes, looking at trade records, artistic influences, forgotten portraits, and the global exchange of ideas, they start noticing something remarkable. The Renaissance may not have been the first time civilizations shared knowledge on that scale. It may have been a revival of something much older, something that had already connected Africa, the Mediterranean, and parts of Europe thousands of years before Michelangelo was born. And if that deeper connection is real, then the roots of Renaissance brilliance might reach far further back in time than most history books ever imagined. So the real question isn't whether Michelangelo himself fit neatly into one identity or another. The real question is this: what happens when we finally trace the Renaissance all the way back to its true origins? To trace those origins, you have to zoom out, far beyond Florence, far beyond the Renaissance, even beyond Europe itself. Because the story of artistic knowledge moving across civilizations didn't begin in the 1400s. It began in the ancient world, when the Mediterranean wasn't a border separating cultures. It was a corridor connecting them.